So, Canada's economy is at a real crossroads. A massive trade threat from its biggest partner, the US, is forcing a pretty critical choice. Should the country build up walls to defend what it already has? Or should it use this crisis as a chance to rebuild its entire economic foundation from the ground up? And you can tell this is a big deal just by the language being used at the very top. The Prime Minister isn't pulling any punches, calling the US tariff threat a fundamental rupture. That's not a word you use for a little bump in the road. It suggests a potential break in the entire system, and it's definitely setting the stage for some major government action. But here's what makes this whole situation so wild. Right before this so-called rupture, Canada's economic engine was actually humming along pretty nicely. Look at the data for the end of 2024. We're seeing solid growth, strong demand right here at home, and even a nice little bump in productivity. The economy was on firm ground. So this crisis isn't about fixing a broken machine, it's about trying to protect a perfectly good one from a hurricane that just appeared on the horizon. So with that storm rolling in, what's the government's first move? Well, the first instinct is to play defense. Think of it less like a grand redesign of the house and more like grabbing the plywood and sandbags. The immediate goal here is just to weather the storm and protect the people and businesses directly in its path. This defensive strategy really rests on three core pillars. First up, a big fund to help the industries that are getting hit the hardest. Second, a package to help workers who might lose their jobs learn some new skills. And third, a new Buy Canadian policy to prioritize our own suppliers for government work. It's a classic approach, really. Help the companies, help the workers, and try to keep money circulating inside the country. And that first pillar, the one for businesses, it comes with a pretty huge price tag. $5 billion for a new strategic response fund. We're not talking about small change here. This is a massive injection of cash designed to help businesses retool, find new markets, and just, absorb the initial shock from these tariffs. And for the workers, the support is just as direct. There's a reskilling package that aims to retrain about 50,000 people. For those who do get laid off, EI benefits are being extended by a full 20 weeks. And that typical 1-week waiting period to get your benefits? Poof, it's gone. The whole point here is immediate, tangible relief for the people on the front lines of this thing. But, okay, boarding up the windows only works for so long, right? Eventually, you have to start thinking about the foundation of the house itself. And this is where a major think tank, the C.D. Howe Institute, steps into the conversation and asks a much bigger question. What if we used this crisis to actually rebuild, stronger than before? Their argument is actually pretty simple. They're saying defense is just a short-term fix for an immediate problem, but it doesn't do anything about the underlying issues that made Canada so vulnerable to this kind of shock in the first place. To be truly resilient for the long haul, they argue, the country has to tackle some of these long-standing structural problems. Now, to really understand their blueprint, we have to zero in on one word: productivity. And look, this isn't just an economic buzzword. It's not about working longer hours. It's the economic magic sauce that lets us have higher wages and a better standard of living without sparking crazy inflation. It's all about working smarter. And for the C.D. Howe Institute, this is where Canada has a real weakness. So their plan is basically a 3-part structural fix. First, to tackle low business investment, they say, let's cut corporate taxes to make it way more attractive for companies to build and invest right here. Second, to fix our weak innovation pipeline, they want to reform R&D tax credits so that brilliant Canadian ideas actually get turned into Canadian companies and Canadian jobs, instead of just getting sold off. And third, to reduce our dependence on the US, they argue we need to get rid of trade barriers between our own provinces. The goal is to create a much stronger, more dynamic market right here at home. It's a total rewiring of the economy. Okay, so we have the government's emergency plan and the experts' long-term structural reforms. But how is all of this landing on Main Street? Well, the public reaction seems to be a real mix of hope and some pretty serious skepticism. If you look at the government's plan, that reskilling package for 50,000 workers is definitely drawing some criticism. For some people, it just doesn't feel like it's big enough. As one commenter pointed out, if major industries take a really sustained hit, 50,000 could end up being just a drop in the bucket. And this all raises a much, much tougher question. It's one thing to retrain people, which is great, but it's another thing entirely to make sure there are actually jobs waiting for them on the other side. Is the training we're offering actually aligned with what the economy is going to need? And this quote just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the anxiety out there. The big fear is that these programs could train thousands of people for industries that are already full or just aren't growing. And that just creates a really frustrating dead end for workers who did everything they were asked to do. The Buy Canadian policy also brings up another key question. It sounds popular, sure, but the practical concern is pretty immediate. If the government now has to buy from more expensive Canadian suppliers, doesn't that just mean that taxpayers are footing a bigger bill for everything? But here's the powerful counter-argument to that. The thinking here is that paying a little bit more upfront is actually an investment. It keeps strategic industries alive, it keeps profits and paychecks and taxes circulating right here in Canada. And it prevents the much, much higher long-term cost of just standing by and watching whole sectors of our economy disappear. So this really leaves us with two very different philosophies for how to get through this crisis. One is all about immediate protection. The other is about long-term transformation. And yeah, they both share the same goal of a prosperous Canada, but they propose two starkly different paths to get there. Let's look at how the two paths stack up. On one side, you have the government's plan, basically building walls with cash funds, worker support, and Buy Canadian policies. And on the other side, you have the CD Howe blueprint, rebuilding the foundation with tax reform, better innovation policy, and a unified Canadian market. And that really is the billion-dollar question. Faced with this economic rupture, does Canada focus on just reinforcing the house it already has, hoping the storm passes? Or does it take the riskier but potentially more rewarding path of tearing things down to the studs and building something entirely new, something designed to withstand the storms of the future?